thing as well? Having your bike in your living room?
I don't know. Is it?
I've never seen this with any, like in any other country.
I mean, I live in the Detroit of Germany. I have like an actual interest in taking my bike upstairs.
Yes, that's true. In Germany, you should. But I would almost imagine that because that's the inspiration, your virtual background would be nothing but like a bike lot, like interesting bikes, like for sale and everything else. So,
I'm actually not that bike nerdy.
it serves a useful function.
Yes, it does.
Got it. Graham, you're alive. Thank goodness.
I'm not sure whether you're alive. You're pushing the boundaries.
Oh, I knew that was coming. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. This is day 4 of the Dash. And now featuring a working underlying functional internet that no longer kind of like breaks things and move things around where it's supposed to be. So today's focus is going to be more about prototyping. And for some people that were part of the original Dash week, some of this is going to seem pretty familiar. And for those of you who are familiar with prototyping, this is also going to seem very, very familiar because it is really, really replicating some of the things you would see in Alberto Savoya's prototyping book. But this is meant to take what we had originally shown yesterday as kind of a precursor to prototyping, and where we were just attempting to get signal and then going into the actual practice of how to do prototypes. The difference between yesterday and today is that today is going to be more instructional heavy, meaning that you're going to see a lot more supplemental material around how to do prototypes. So it's less about interpretation and more about viewing the instructions and seeing if you're understanding and clarifying what it's asking you for. And that's purposeful because the contrast was yesterday, it was open-ended and you can interpret how you're supposed to do the exercise, versus this one, which is very like, this is kind of how you do it. So again, if you know prototyping, this is going to be a no-brainer. If you've never done this before, it's going to be interesting to see what your reactions are and how you interpret what's being asked. Okay? So if you've been following the series so far this week, you know everyone who's currently on the call. They're so famous they don't need introductions. But at some point, if we'd like to get into that later on, we can most certainly do so. But for now, let's get into the meat of the matter and not waste anyone's time and kind of get into the canvas. So that's what I'll do at this point. So for everyone on the panelist side, I'm going to share the URL for the canvas. And I think it's similar. It's the same one as yesterday, but I'm not going to bank on that. I'm going to go back into Zoom and give you the link that you're supposed to have. Boom. Right. So when you have that link, you should see something that says the audience, the experiment, and signal results. And that should be a good starting point for you. I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. And by the way, I'm suffering from really bad allergies this morning. So if you hear me sniff, it's not because I'm sad. It's because I desperately need a Kleenex, and I may go off camera to have that happen. So let me go ahead and share what I'm talking about so that I'm not telling an interesting story. Okay. So like I had said, in previous days, we worked out the audience that we were going to be focusing on for our experiments. In the Dash, we figured out that they were in the low pain, low buying power kind of place. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll go ahead and summon everyone where I'm at. The experiment that we worked out, and this is hypothetical because we didn't get through the entire thing, was the pandemic promotion package, where it states when thinking about promoting themselves on social media, musicians will purchase an affordable pandemic promotional package to learn how to better market themselves in a tight market. And when we did our signals, meaning we just want to do some small tests to see if people were interested, we got some pretty favorable results in the sense that the first test was all right. We did a little bit of tweaking in the second test. It didn't work, but then we did a little bit more tweaking on the third test, and we found that there's a little bit of a stronger signal with this kind of arrangement, given all things being equal around when it's done and how it's done. So what we're going to do today is start going through an actual prototyping process. And like I said, I'll start putting things into the main canvas. If at any time you have questions, clarifications, need to understand what's being asked of you, then like previous days, speak up, come off microphone, raise your hand, scream, yell, shout, whatever you'd like to do. And we'll definitely make sure that you are heard. So this is not me dictating the pace. This is more a dialogue on what's being shown. So I will lose my focus for a second. And where was I? I was on this day. Okay. Let me pause my share real fast and go into the day that I'm supposed to be on and bring this over. Did not want to copy? Please hold. There we go. Bring this down like this. Wait, okay. So this part is about the market engagement hypothesis. And what this is a way of basically in plain language and common language, being able to describe how you think our audience is going to engage the market opportunity that we had spelled out up here. Now, it seems like we may have already done this by the way of how we constructed it. But what this exercise is asking you to do is to put it in like something where if you were talking to someone else, how would you describe what the opportunity is? But do it so in such a way where you're saying, you know, maybe if we did it this way, then this would be the end result. And what I've done over here on the side in the meh examples are things that came straight out of the Write It book, and to basically illustrate how it's done, as well as some instructional material on how to do it. My first question to the group is, based on what's done here and what's been done in the previous day with the signal, does the idea of being able to create something like this do you think it's still challenging? Do you think you've had like a reference point up here to work with? What do you think of what's being presented here? I guess would be a good starting point. What are you taking in? And I'll start with Diane at this point. Or if Diane doesn't want to talk, we can go to America. Either way.
I think so. Here we are defining our hypothesis, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I think it makes all the sense. I'm just if I'm not mistaken, this is the same journey we have been previously, and yeah, it makes all the sense. In your previous session, we would hand with a couple experiments. Correct. And here we are defining the hypothesis.
Right. So the purpose of the day before was to introduce people to the concept of creating something like this without giving it the name. So I took out the nomenclature altogether and had everyone walk through the idea of thinking about the situation, the audience, what they would do, and why they would do it. This basically goes back to the original process and says, okay, write out something very similar to what you did yesterday, but do it in free language, basically writing it out in terms of how you would basically tell someone else. You don't have to go into detail around the percentage. You don't have to go into detail about exactly what happens, but basically you follow along with the examples that are on the left in constructing something that you think is representative of what we're doing. And that should also, the idea is that the signal work you did the previous day would inform you on how you could actually script that out. Because after about 3 signal tests that were like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours long, then you would have an idea of what this could potentially be based on that input. So this is meant to basically re-engage the flow of the actual hypothesis without getting lost. Because what I noticed when we tried doing it the first time is that this thing was just, it didn't translate for anybody. They weren't exactly sure how to write it and if they were doing it correctly. The signal is basically a primer for doing something like this.
Okay, I'm feeling like I'm going one step backwards, but I understand now.
Okay.
It's
So
okay.
Robert, the signal tests, the signal results up at the top, those are not the Pretotype.
No, it's not. It's just basically when you were just when you're just trying to figure out if there was interest, or at least there was some sort of indication for the market that there was an interest in it. Beyond, it wasn't a full-blown Pretotype. It was just a signal test. It was just to see if where you put your attention actually elicited some reaction. Now with this, what we're doing today is we're actually constructing an hypothesis with percentages and numbers and details that's going to elicit like a better kind of measured response. So you can see, you can go into Bayes' theorem, you can go into all sorts of analysis tools to do that.
Okay, so yeah, I thought that Pretotyping, that was what it was supposed to be, was sort of in doing signals, but I understand what you've done. So you just created a very tongue tip test on whether there's interest through some form of quick check. Okay.
And try to make that process on day 3 much more human, in the sense that you weren't falling back on acronyms and trying to be very explicit versus success versus failure. You were just trying to see if there was like there seemed to be some sort of reflection in the market for your idea.
Okay.
It's even more lightweight, because too many times when you do hypothesis, you're thinking, and that came out in some of the examples yesterday, people were thinking in terms of hours and days right off the bat. They couldn't really, there wasn't the translation of how to get this done in a very short period of time. So the first part that we went through yesterday teaches you about it. This part is the actual thing where you're going through the process, but now you have some context as to how to kind of create it. So if you were to take this all in one day, the signal test is going to be something that you can do and break away and go to day 2 if you want. Or the signal test is as a preparation for how to do the market engagement hypothesis. And the question will come up is like, why do the signal test and just go to meh? It's because when I tried doing that the first time with a couple of other groups, it goes completely off. By the time you get 2 or 3 steps down and you're actually building the WXYZ hypothesis and hypozooming, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of teaching that has to happen around those concepts. So I find there's a bit more hand-holding with this than what a design sprint typically is. And a design sprint needs it anyway, but definitely for this.
Okay, so just to summarize, hypothetically, yesterday we created this
pandemic promotional package. Go ahead. Sorry. Go, Diana.
First of all, we looked at what our potential fake audience was doing, what their troubles and pains are, and created the pandemic promotional package out of it as a solution. And we had a first signal test, as you called it, by, I don't know, putting like an advertisement somewhere, and 205 people clicked. Yeah.
They paid. They actually paid money, not click through, but they actually paid for the promotional package based on what was put there. So there was a button that said pay now or pay $159. And when they clicked on that, there was a message that came up saying, we're not quite ready to take in orders, but if you could, like leave your email address, something like that.
That's what I meant. Yeah. Okay. And now today we translate this. So we have the first signal that there might be an actual interest in the market. And now we try to look at the market and the competition. Or
for this, we're taking what we've done in the experiment. So in this situation, our audience will choose this for this reason. And we're reframing it into a market engagement hypothesis. We're taking it out of boxes and we're putting it freestyle. So we're literally writing it here. But the variation on this is going to be based on our impressions of what happened during the signal test. So it's basically transmuting what's here and putting it into this form. And it may help if I kind of bring over the next step in this to you can kind of see the progression of how things work. So let me make sure I've got enough room on the canvas, and I'll go ahead and do that. So then it's just like yesterday where you can kind of see the steps that are involved with everything. So give me 1 second. Wish I had, there's a button on Zoom where I could just basically hit that and it could just be like a quick kind of like Muzak kind of thing before I brought it back in. So there is, it's going to take a minute to render. There we go. So there's this. So same thing as before. After you write your market engagement hypothesis and put it in this space, you're going to break it down again into boxes. So when, where, the percentage of the audience based on the signal that you think would be measured into this, the audience, in this case, it would be musicians, will do this. So you're reframing it into this again. So it's basically, it may seem like you're doing extra steps to kind of formulate this, but this is necessary because a lot of times the steps that go from actually taking something from a market engagement hypothesis to a WXYZ hypothesis is not as clear as it seems. So that's why there's so many explicit examples and instructions on how to do it, that this is primarily an education piece. Whereas yesterday was going through the motions, this is now, okay, this is how to properly do this sort of thing. And it's instructional heavy for a reason. Because if you don't get this right and you're kind of being a little bit more ambiguous around the percentage, around the audience, around where you're going with things, this requires, or at least this step requires you to be a little bit more succinct on how you're going to do it. And all the examples are here in terms of the initial market engagement hypothesis for an Uber-like service that picks up and delivers laundry. I mean, it literally goes into how to do XYZ and then WXYZ. All of it's there to basically for people to kind of scour and read and basically interpret. So does that help, Diana? Or do you see things a different way based on what's being presented here?
It does help, definitely. Just from the angle of us explaining today, it's gonna be quite hard as we do not have any results from yesterday, wouldn't it? But yeah. I do understand the exercise and it does clearly make sense.
So my question would be to the group is, if this was what you were presented with on day 3 rather than the signal, would that have been better, worse, or you're not sure?
It will be worse. It will be worse, more confusing, more demanding, more educational. No. Simplify it, please.
I like that. That was clear.
What should so my follow-up question is, what should this be even simplified? Yesterday was simplified. It didn't use all of the acronyms and things. If you're presented with this, is this too heavy?
I don't think so.
Or does it feel like it should be a natural progression to learn?
I guess it would depend also on your audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Depending on what space they're in and, you know, the level of problems that they're trying to solve. You know, do you need something as heavyweight as this? Potentially, maybe, but I don't know. I would probably experiment with it. Excuse me, depending on the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, the audience has a major impact in elaborating all these hypotheses. However, you introduce one thing that is a signal and then the prototype. It's like a refinement, and that is very important. I don't know if this fits in a 5-day design sprint because it requires time, but I think that is very, very important. Today I saw a presentation by the Google Design Sprint channel from chapter from Shanghai or something like that, and there was a guy presenting his work, and he was doing not only one refinement but several refinements, and it was not prototyping. But I think this solution is great if you need to educate people, but I think that is too much. I think the option, the path you chose yesterday is more lightweighted, is easier, it's more intuitive, and it's not cumbersome.
The other thing also is that the one thing that lacks yet from yesterday is this part, which is like the actual like data adherence or the percentage of things. Yeah. Because I found that most people were just basically guessing when they were doing this part here, and I'll kind of point it out in this part.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah. When we were doing this a couple of months ago, we will put a number just by guessing. Well, just by guessing. Mm-hmm. And now we have a market signal to set limits in our in construction of the market engagement hypothesis.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I was distracted. The notion that you could basically pull out a number without knowing context was what the signal was meant to do, is to kind of give an idea of what the realistic percentage would be out of the audience here, so that the signal would basically provide the impetus or the foundation for this. Now, here's one thought. Since this is basically going into formulating the XYZ, the next step in this is hypozooming, which you're going to kind of clarify both the percent or the audience and some of the other things here, what they might do. And since that work was done previously in this could be what they call in the book as a scenario, where it's a variation on a theme. So here's a question I have for some of you that are kind of looking at this, like for Cody, I'm going to call on you for a second. What I've been struggling with is that the signal was meant to be simple, kind of straightforward, not a lot of jargon. And it took out purposely the ability to put percentages or put numbers across things. Do you think a hybrid of these particular steps and what you experienced yesterday with the experiment, do you think that would help to clarify your understanding of how to do those exercises, or would it just kind of confuse things?
I mean, I may have the advantage that I've read the Pretotyping, I've read the Write It, so I kind of have that 10,000 foot view. So for me to see the 3 steps, like these 3 pieces, even just to see them as a highlight, and then kind of dive into one, would help set up that, like, okay, we're going here and then here and then here. So that actually brings, like, seeing these 2 in the context of yesterday actually brings a lot of clarity for me. To try and tackle them all at once would have been hard. It's interesting though, I was struggling with the market engagement hypothesis, although I understand it. I was like, oh, what would I write here? And it wasn't until I saw you put in the WXYZ that I was like, okay, I feel clearer about this. So the pieces together definitely helped.
Do you think that, and this is a question for everyone, do you think that that this is redundant since we've already done it here on the first day? So really, if we're talking about the starting point for this day, you're really talking about this. So if you were to come into this part after doing the signal, you already have your market engagement hypothesis done. Now what you're doing is you're going a little bit deeper into the data that you've collected and starting to get numbers around their engagement. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot more sense.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that really lands, because this part I was just like, yes, I know how to break this apart now.
Okay. So the experiment is just a really elongated, extended meh, and kind of like testing that meh before you're going into this. Okay.
I think it has a lot of value because in that experiment, we got into the pain, the solution, a little bit about like the product, even as far as the name. So you had to kind of think about it a little bit more than a kind of a more lofty, just a solution for this. So I think it helped to clarify a lot more. I'd feel a lot more confident going into this WXYZ hypothesis after yesterday, compared to if we just did the meh and then he went here. I don't think I'd feel as developed with the idea.
So this entire part here could probably be taken out since it's represented up top, so you don't reinterpret it. So really what you're doing is you're looking at this, where it's really this over here. So now you're getting into like the actual like writing of this based on where this is, and you're just incorporating what you did in the signal for this particular part.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, give me a minute. I'll bring in the next part of this. By the way, if you're watching or observing, if you do have any questions, then do speak up. More than happy to field those if they are. So I'm going to throw something at you that's not quite done. So this is basically something where it's trying to explain hypozooming in a different way. But let me put this in because there's multiple pieces to it. So we'll start with this one first. What I found is that there are certain activities that are more akin to digital work than there are physical. So my emphasis with the dash is just on digital work alone or digital byproducts. So when you see this and you see the pretotypes that are being displayed here for consideration, that's the kind of where the emphasis is on this. So I'll bring it up to this point here. So what this is meant to do is to kind of give an example first of how to test the market. And it runs through this step by step. So it says, okay, if you want to explore a pretotype to test the market with, these are the ones that seem to be the most popular with people that want to do something digitally and what those examples are. So I include examples from the book and what's been said about how those are done. It doesn't give all 12 or all 11 examples because I found that people were a little confused as to what to choose. And what I've attempted to do here is just to isolate the choices to like a top 5. And then the hypozooming here is to basically show an example of what a hypozoom is so that it adds a few other things that are normally not in the book. So I'll explain what I'm talking about. So in this statement that we originally did is that when K-12 to 12 school teachers are considering their options for continuing education, they'll do a design thinking workshop. And for reference, I would probably create this in advance before this session starts so that I would take from those boxes and create the mess statement for people if they wanted to have that reference. Then it would take the original XYZ that we have and evaluate as to whether or not we should kind of zoom in on the audience and be very specific about something that's in our locale or within our situation. So it's just making sure that for engagement, the target market, the skin in the game, and the time frame, we're really thinking about we're starting to constrict where we can basically play. But this is what I was saying before about being overly verbose, but being very specific about the examples so that this doesn't get lost with people. So that when they talk about hypozoom, it's not basically adding more words to it. It's really getting specific on who you're going to be testing with and who you're going to be talking to. So the interesting thing about this one is that the skin in the game down here, and I'll kind of summon everyone so that you're in the same spot I am. If I can make it work, hang on a second. There we go. So this one changed from pay $59 for a 5-day design thinking workshop to would use their personal email address to sign up for updates. And this was basically in response to the market not purchasing this, but when they're actually not purchasing, but there was an option to give an email address. So they were more akin to do that. This was just to kind of follow on those learnings initially and basically make something that was a little bit more palpable so that maybe they weren't ready for a commitment or they needed approval to get their funding. And we went down this road for this particular exercise. So the first thing I'll do is first impressions. What do you think of this particular presentation of material? Is it useful? Is it too much? And I'm going to go to Finn first. If you could, Finn, tell me what your impressions are of this assembly of information and if it's understandable or if it's confusing, what's going through your mind?
So generally, generally I like it. I think with the layout and everything, it's fine. A common theme for me has been that there's quite a lot of text in your explanations. So especially if we're talking about a remote workshop, I would probably be drawn to trying to read everything through before I am able to rejoin the group mentally and be fully there. So I think, I mean, it really depends on who you're working with. and if the education with the examples stated and everything is needed, then you're providing a good amount of information. But it would have to be kept in mind that the members of the Dash need a bit of time to read through everything, or we would have to go through everything together or something. But generally, I think it's very clear, and I think this could be a part where it's really important to be specific and to work clean for the design sprint or for the Dash to have a clear outcome. And especially in this phase, the steps are very small. You're making it very clear on what to do.
JF, what are your thoughts?
I'm still processing. I do agree with Finn in that if you are running this for the first time, there's definitely a lot of verbose information that one sees immediately. And so I've been in scenarios where I'm in a facilitation meeting of a brainstorm, for example, and people will start reading as opposed to listening to you from that perspective. Would you present this in one shot to people? Or would you kind of present things in a layered fashion where you introduce things one at a time and then show the big picture at the end?
So it would probably be the latter. And something that Diana said yesterday was makes me think that this particular part of a prototype to experiment with is going to have some context. So Diana, if you remember, we talked about how it's built, or there were two steps in the previous thing that weren't in the process, where like how to build it and how to build it and why was it being built or something. There were two additional ones. This would be introduced at this step as well. So even though it seems like there's no explanation or no activity that goes along with it, the idea is that based on these 5 different examples of prototypes during the signal test, this would be the first impression they would have of each of those, and which one would be more appropriate to build the prototype out of. So though you didn't see it yesterday, this exercise takes a certain level of familiarity based on the previous day that you didn't get a chance to see. But to answer your question, JF, it wouldn't be all at the same time. The idea being is that there would be some sort of context or activity that corresponds to this, where you choose one of these. Then this is the example of the Hypozoom, and then collectively it would be a conversation among everyone as to how to take the examples that we see here and kind of bringing them down so that they're much more testable. Or you can get particular data that where if you're not as explicit as you need to be, you can basically go one way or one direction or another. I did have one render where it actually had the W and the X in the center, and then it had like the greater or lesser, so people could play around with that a bit. I didn't include it here just because it started to become like cognitive overload. It already is right now with all the instructions to a certain extent. So yeah, to answer your question, it's meant to be, okay, you're going to pick one of these. Probably doesn't need all the text that it has, but then we're going to experiment with hypozooming, and then there would be some space here for actually hypozooming certain the original hypothesis that people have, like the top 3 that are voted on, to kind of move forward into an actual experiment. So that was the intent with this.
Got it. Understood.
Graham, what are you thinking?
So I think there's room for handouts which you can give people to read between sessions. So some of the detail of the text just as a thought, so supporting material, and giving people some homework. We give them other work to do overnight. So that's one idea. My understanding of the hyperzooming is to find an audience you can get to that is representative of your big W, big XYZ. Mm-hmm. So it's actually about the restaurant down the road, or the artist colony on the outskirts of town, or whatever it is you're working with, about people you can get to directly to, rather than an academic exercise of shrinking or enlarging a market. Am I correct in that statement?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. So that's a context which doesn't necessarily, you haven't talked about in the hyperzooming. It's about, well, who can you get to? You can't get to the 10% of the world's entrepreneurs, but you can get to the 5 entrepreneurs you know through your buddy John, as a first test, for example. And so it sort of comes through in your wider audience of educators who teach K-6-12 in CBFISD in Irving, and that's because you can get to that organization in Irving as the tester.
Yeah, I think that's what's missing is like the emphasis on what do you have access to.
Yep.
And I've done that in previous exercises before. Like what do you have access to beyond like what you're stating here? Who in your with where you are, what's the distance to data, so to speak, or the distance to the other measurements that he has in the book. I just didn't use those explicit kind of terms to kind of go from there. So
you had those in your original templates, but you've taken those all out to simplify it, have you?
Kind of, yeah. But again, I'll revisit what I had originally done to kind of see if what go with simple versus complex. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of rearranging here, so bear with me for a second. I'm going to actually take these 2 things out. I'm going to take out the mess statement for a second. So I'm going down the simplification road a little bit. So I'm going to take out this divider here and bring this over. So I'm doing a little bit of design on the fly. So I'm going to move the pretotyping things over here. Now, what we did in the previous one is we actually went from this, and we had the hypozooming directly next to it, though it was a different adherence to it, or a different way of going about it, where you still had the context of what you had just done, but what you now were able to do was actually, to your point, Graham, talk about what do you have access to. So project this into like the hypothetical XWXYZ. What actually translates for your environment, or what you can actually see yourself doing.
Yeah, so it's like the sushi, like the restaurant at Stanford, on campus, 100 meters from me.
Okay, let me put a note here.
And that's the first. Then okay, so that doesn't represent the total universe. So you have to find another example, which is maybe a bit further away, a bit harder to get to, which then creates another set of data that you use into your thinking, whether you use Bayes or not. There's another question.
Yeah, plus that would actually open up for the scenarios that the book talks about. So the scenarios are really all the local examples for each person. So if you're talking about taking what's here and interpreting this, or maybe you don't even need all of this, like say if you were to do this and you just basically translate the audience here, what you're really doing the next step after you put in WXYZ, because it should translate over fairly well. You don't need to do variations across the theme. The group exercise, what you're talking about is the WXYZ really, the hypozooming. Yep. So that you're saying, now that you have this, project it into something that is tangible and reachable for you in particular, and figure out how that translates. So you don't need to go bigger or smaller. You just go, how could you test it locally? How could you test it in your environment?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's something where, let me take this out. It's going to lose context, but you're talking about taking this and bringing it over here and that would be at the top. Like this would be at the top, and then all of these rows down here would be how you would actually go about doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why it's important to have a team of an appropriate size with the appropriate diversity, because they each have access to different pools of resources, places, spaces, experiences that can test it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this enriches with to do an XYZ on your own, you're limited to your own resources, and there's probably a group size that says, right, we can probably find 3 ways to do a small XYZ to enrich the test because of the background and experience of the team.
Would that also indicate that all of the different pretotype options they do would be kind of reliant on the personnel that was involved with that particular statement, that particular experiment that was localized, or would there be value in basically having everyone adhere to a particular type of Pretotype, so that if you were to do any kind of analysis on the data side, you could essentially figure that out. Like you would be, if one group did a fake door, another one did YouTube, another one did provincial, and went down those roads. Is that something where if you put it into Bayes' theorem or some other analysis kind of framework, that would make sense? Or do you have everyone align on a particular type of Pretotype?
I think, I mean, of the 5 you've chosen to put up there, I mean, some of them are harder to do. So the MVP is so I see they're kind of very early ideas. You do simple things like a fake door or a YouTube. Then as that creates data to continue doing, then you work with the more advanced ones like an MVP. So I think flattening the architecture of the Pretotypes, so they look equivalent, but you just got 5 there, but they're not. An MVP is a very, very different set of work to be done than a fake door or a YouTube advert.
So these what do you call them, badges, are not necessarily just basically between the examples, but the parameters. So we're talking about the different parameters that people would need to consider, like time needed to, and I'll change this later, but time needed to create, how many people,
yeah,
like there's like resources needed. Go ahead and go on mic if you want, about things that you would want to know about this particular Pretotype to figure out if it's a good match for a team.
There's something too about this, like the scale. Like I'm just thinking about, in the book he was talking about, if you have a testing budget of like 100,000, bring it down to 10,000. If you had an initial idea of 1,000, bring it down to 100. If you had 100, bring it down to 2. And so there was something about like looking at the scale of the project to kind of also help determine and make it smaller than you initially thought. But, if it's a mom and pop thing where we're trying to make the test $100 versus, a Google kind of a test where, $10,000 is a pretty cheap test, it might dictate which one of those tests you use, like Pretotypes you use.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Like a budget range, maybe time needed to create, and like there's a certain amount of time that you need for a YouTube, and how many people and resources needed.
Yeah, exactly.
Are beyond the 5 here, are there any other ones that should be kind of stated here?
Does it look good?
I think so, at least initially. And kind of flesh that out a bit. Okay. So then when we're going down the test, it may be a matter of figuring out, based on this metadata, what makes sense to kind of put in for a choice, and say like what seems to make sense for which teams and what particular situation. And then just if there's more metadata that goes into it, we can go for it. Okay. Right. So let me bring over the other parts of this real fast, and hang on a minute. We'll get into some of the more detailed things. So let me see here. This is going to be more of the instructional material, and you'll have to forgive me, Graham. I know that you've sent me over like Bayes' theorem in terms of like how to basically go about the interpretation, and I wanted to showcase something that I had worked on previously, just to see how it would translate. But I already know how it's going to translate before I even paste it, but that's okay. This was one alternative way of kind of looking at data and kind of presenting it in a fashion so you understand what seems to make, or how to basically read it. So the evaluate and score your XYZ hypothesis would be like the number of steps that you would have to basically get something done. So this goes into distance of data, hours of data, and dollars of data explicitly. So it literally calls them out. So the amount of steps you need to basically take to get to to use in the experiment that you've chosen to get to the data that you're looking for, and being able to optimize it to basically say, okay, what could we do that could actually make it like less work intensive. Same thing with the number of hours of prototyping. You're going to estimate the amount of hours you would normally take to do something, and seeing if you can basically optimize it a bit and bring it down so that's less hours. So the idea is that you have an initial idea of how things are built, but when you actually put it into a space, you're going to be looking at it to say, okay, can we break this down even further so that we spend less time on it, there's less steps, and we wanted to know how much cost there was. Now, the cost here was basically in dollars, but there will also be a cost in terms of time, but that's kind of indicated in hours to data. So there wasn't much optimization to be had here. But the idea is that you would take what you had done in terms of like the test you're going to do, write out the steps you think were going to be there, and then being able to optimize it for the experiment when you eventually did it. And then finally here was one possible way of kind of evaluating the results and how that would correspond to your WXYZ and how you did the time, and how you would actually like get the points and draft those out. So this is more of an example, but how you would actually track the experiments is probably highly dependent on culture of who's going to be doing this. So they may be tracking something in an existing application. They may use spreadsheets. They may not necessarily use Mural to track everything else. This is just basically meant to show how you should score prototypes, and gives instructions on how to do that in terms of 1 point for every personal email address, a point for every minute of time, or a point for every unit of local currency, and tries to educate on how that's actually done. So again, like before, take a look at this. There's a lot to take in. And if you want to have a reaction or a thought, just come off mic and tell me what you're thinking.
Just a quick one. For me, it's not about optimization. It's just about forcing people to stop being lazy. Because people want to feel safe. They want to throw a bit more money at it. They want to throw a bit more time just to deal with the feeling that comes from being safer. So my understanding is why he does that is just to stop being so lazy and make it cheap, because that's what you're trying to figure out.
Fast and cheap is the theme of this entire thing.
Yeah. So stop trying to look after your ego and be safe. Just make it cheaper and get it done.
Or how could you, or based on the personnel that's working on this, how can you find a better way of making it work with less, or to take less steps to try to do it? That's what was my intent, is to try and kind of optimize the process. So it isn't just, okay, we have to do this prototype. How are we going to do it? Let's just have Americo write a bunch of ads and put those up. It forces more of a group effort or a group consensus or a group conversation about what needs to be done and who's going to do it. At least that's the idea behind this. In America, when you did your first prototype experiment, would something like this would have helped to be able to graph out kind of the steps that were involved with kind of doing the prototype?
I think it would have helped for team commitment, like maybe like that, because I had the process in my mind, but there was no. I think the other members of the team were not aware of the effort. However, I think putting the specific value in time and money, may not be that interesting. I think that, just my opinion. For instance, in one of our examples, the team just casually, we met in a Sunday, and we did a complete experiment that was really complex, a full day. And it was because the team was there, not because that will take some time or some money. It's just the commitment of the team to make things. When we put the money here in the time, that is very cultural. That's very dependent of the organization and the culture. I will prefer to see grading in 5 stars. Like this Pretotype has a score of 1 in time, in score in whatever the dimensions. Just that. So this would help me for the team to be aware of effort, and if we understand that it requires little time, we have a bigger predisposition to make it happen soon or fast. If it takes more time, maybe we will delay, and that is what happened in the chipmunk team.
So I had a suggestion earlier on for this one, where this distance or steps taken is actually done so that when you're talking about the steps that are involved with actually building out the Pretotype, it's not a list. This is like the end result. What you actually do is you have something where there's a kind of a space where people can write out all the steps they think are needed to do in order to be able to get something done. The only issue with that is that if you did something like this, then you end up with people being very general, not specific. Like people would just kind of put in, say like for this, it'd be like design work or something else related to that, where it wasn't as specific as the steps, where you couldn't see it going through. Or you could do what we did yesterday, where there's a beginning where you kind of color code it, like here's the starting point, and then there's another part where there's an ending point. And then people can kind of graft out what they think would be needed for each of these particular, for whatever Pretotype they choose, how they would go about constructing it, and kind of going down this road so that you narrow it down to 6 or 7 steps, and then people can vote on which ones they seem that seem to make the most sense. Then you have a storyline to actually build out the Pretotype and what's going to be needed so that you have proper coverage on content, design, engineering, and everything else. What do you think about that approach?
I think that if we have a couple steps, because this is not new for you, for me. I know what will be necessary to provide to create a YouTube experiment. I know it because I did it. If we all close a couple steps, it will make things faster. Like for a YouTube, you have like these steps, this and that, and leave for 2 or 3 extra fields for people to fill in with specifics of their company or their team. But I would prefer to see something predefined that people call then arrange or change in accordance with their team or contexts.
Yeah. And what people are capable of being able to do, like what for the team that's assembled or that's concentrating on this, what are their skill sets and what can they actually get done? That would be the other emphasis. JF, what are your thoughts so far in terms of kind of like fleshing out this particular part here where we're talking about the steps needed to be taken rather than they're being written out? This pre-assumes that there's some understanding of what the steps are for each of these, but I think there's some sort of exercise that needs to happen to kind of flesh that out a bit. But what are your thoughts? What do you think?
So there's a couple of things that are going in my head right now. One, I like the start and stop, the green and blue that you have, and just keep it as here's the 2 start and end states ideally, and then don't even suggest 1, 2, 3, 4 steps, right? Part of it is just say this is the start state, this is the end state. Have the teams think about those and what it takes to get there. And then that's when I think teams can start putting different stickies to actually come up to that, and then refine from those number of stickies. Can we make this smaller, right?
Right.
So that's one thing, because then this is where I see your budgets, like the DTD, the DTD, and the hours to data, and so on and so forth, where you start with something and say, let's refine it from this other way. I can also see this being asked a boundary.
Mhm.
Let's say if your teams have done this, so you might be able to do this where here's the bounds that I want you to constrain yourselves with, because I think if you also start with there are two things I'm seeing here, where if you start with unbounded, it generates a different set of ideas, and if you start with something constrained, it also generates a different set of ideas. And having those two can actually give you a more holistic view that maybe might spur some more thinking of things you may not have known. So that's where I'm kind of seeing this right now.
Yeah. There was another suggestion I'll bring up here where after these steps are taken, so this is time bound, where the first step is going to be like if it's always going to be gather materials for the prototype, like basically figure out where those are. And then the final one is, so if it's YouTube, it's like publishing YouTube video and tracking results, just hypothetically. There are all the steps in here. There's these little icons that are time, meaning that the perception by the team is that certain things are going to take more time than others. And you can use as many of these as you want to basically put in these white spaces to indicate that this may be something that's going to take considerable more time. That's what's shown. Whereas this one, publishing the YouTube video and tracking results, may not. Gathering materials for the prototype may take some time. But when it comes to actually voting or choosing a particular way of kind of constructing what this is going to look like, and figuring out what that is, these little time icons will basically be an influence as to what's chosen, what's not chosen, especially if there's a certain time budget that's corresponding. So if you give people, like, you have to do it in 24 hours, if there's something that has a ton of time things on there, certain boxes that people are putting in there, there's a recognition that it may not fit the time budget you're thinking about. What are your thoughts about kind of doing something like that?
I kind of like it. I can see where it's coming from. Yeah, it's another way of thinking of things. Something in the toolbox that I might pull out, depending on the audience.
Yeah, I think it may be contextual, but it's a possible approach. Cody, what are your thoughts about this so far?
I liked what JF said about, in the beginning, not having the constraint of the cards, to sort of say, like, there's steps, you name them, because I can see how, without thinking about it, I'm like, okay, what are the 4 steps? Because there's 4 cards, even though I know that they could be 2 or 10. The other part I really liked that you just did, and I was like, oh, actually, so the green and the blue cards, seeing that for, say, YouTube, is so clear that actually might be something that would help. Like, if you could see the beginning step and the end step for each of the 5 options, that might actually help a team to say, that's the one for us. We can kind of see that playing out in the decision between the 5 different options. I'm not sure if that made sense, but it was just like, oh yes, like, it really paints the picture of what that option is, to see what's the beginning, what's the end of this step in choosing which one to use.
Do you think that you have to, so you're saying that you should probably work out the steps and how you want to build it and then choose the Pretotype type, or do you think that you need the Pretotype container in order to be able to do the steps?
I think it was more just seeing even just the end, or the beginning and the end step. Like, if I saw that for each of the 5 options as part of what was shown, it was easier to go, oh yeah, that I can see, like, the mind just kind of starts to flow into which one might be the one to choose. It was just really helpful to see the beginning step as the end step as part of the decision-making process. Did that make sense? Did that clarify?
Yeah. So yeah. I'm going to throw a hypothetical. Let's say this doesn't exist. So you don't have to really look at, like, the type that you're considering. Like, the type is discounted, and really the steps to get to, like, how to actually make this work is the topic of discussion. So really you're talking about how you're going to build the Pretotype that you're thinking about and the steps involved doing it. Then you can give it whatever title Pretotype you want, but it's the steps in and of itself are the more important things, where you're talking about like time budget and cost budget related to some of the steps that people's put here. When it's all said and done and you've gone through this process, you have like a task list of different things you need to do to create the prototype you're talking about. And what you call it or how it's framed or how it's categorized is irrelevant. It just basically says, okay, implied in the XYZ hypothesis is a particular way of going about it. Do you think that's valuable, or do you think you still need kind of a sample of different ways prototypes have been done in the past to be able to envision how this could go?
Seems like somewhere in the middle. I just feel like if it was just blank, it might be like, it might actually almost artificially limit like the creativity. Like hearing some of the examples, I was like, oh, I never would have thought of that. However, a structure where maybe it was like there was, you know, five kind of green to blues, and the blues were all the different types. So then it was a matter of like, which one are people gravitating to fill in as the option? Wow. Okay. You know, we've all gravitated towards the morsel one. Maybe we should look at this one. Like something where you could see them all in a matrix and people could choose.
So basically the nature of the content of the cards will basically dictate the direction of where it could go. You just have to see how it naturally, organically progresses as you kind of work through the example. Okay.
Yeah, and so that was the part that seeing the green to the blue card, I found like, those two together like that. If it was like, you know, get prototype materials, create, you know, have a fake store, you know, get prototype materials, create a video. And then it was like, take 5 minutes, you know, build it under the column that seems to fit the prototype you want to build. That combined really helped to go like, oh, wow, I never thought of this application. Yeah.
Okay. Diana, what are your thoughts?
So this definitely looks like what I was missing yesterday, this whole exercise. I think what I had in mind yesterday when we did talk about the 24-hour window, after this step, I was like, okay, so how are we going to test it? We have an idea now. We set our minds to something, we decided, and how are we going to test it? And this looks like a really interesting way to actually gather results quickly in a measurable way.
Would you just hypothetically, what if those 2 steps were merged? Like you could still use the same system to get a signal, but then if you wanted to upgrade it and get percentages and start getting data, you could use the same framework, but then you just add, you clarify the percentages after you figure out what seems to work. Okay. So it's less about reinterpreting the instruction set. It's more use the same framework, but then just tweak the parameters so that in the second part of it, you're starting to get more towards data analytics and getting clarifying on a certain thing. Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, it always depends on your audience. If you really just try to help, I think you called it a mom and pop shop. Maybe they're not so interested in the percentages. For them, it could be enough to stop at the signal, because they might not have a lot of money they have to push into an MVP, and they can directly start building a prototype just to go run after a successful signal and give it a try. If it's just a total worth of, I don't know, $100 or $1,000, for example, it might be enough for them as a test, as a market test. That's to true. Already start building. But if you have a company like Google, where there's a $1 million project, then those percentages are just the sweet spot, I would say, to have it a little bit more measurable.
Maybe it could be where all of this is just prototyping, but the first one is the initial experiment, and then this part is all about scenarios. This is all about variations on the original theme if there is an indicator. So now you're really just feeling out to see what else there is there in terms of possibilities. So that the initial approach is to kind of do something like what we're presenting here, but keeping it simple so that you're not overwhelming people with instructions and details, But then getting into the second part of it is that once you do find a signal or find some indication in the market there's desirability, then you start getting into a bit more into the weeds around where you can go with things, changing things up, maybe expanding your audience, maybe doing some other things to kind of get the evidence, but not losing sight of the fact that the first one was meant to be simplistic, but then you got kind of get a bit more detailed in terms of the scenario building you're thinking about. America, what are you thinking?
I'm listening to you and I'm enjoying, because let's about the types of prototypes. I think they shall be there. For me, they shall be there. So the team has to have an understanding of I'm going to build a fake door or on YouTube or something. I have to know where is the ending point. So in the meantime, we can decide what steps we need to build to reach that prototype. About the sign, I feedback about, especially if it's not working, and I never know why it's not working. So for me, I love final phase, and I will do it face-to-face, presential, direct, whatever. I will do it in a manner that will not be digital. But I understand that if you make it digital, this stage, and if it works great, this stage will be just a refinement of metrics, or an ambition statement, let's say, something like that. And that's fine. But I don't envision using the sign-off phase in the world, because from my experience, it doesn't work. It's terrible unless you have a very good site, you invest a lot in advertising, so you have sufficient data in 24 hours, let's say, to make a clear decision to go forward or forget it. That's it. I understand, but I will not like to do the sign-off phase in digital environment.
Yeah. Graham, I got a question for you, and this is a thought I'm having while I'm kind of looking at this and hearing everyone talk about their impressions of this. If we were to frame yesterday and today, and I'm specifically calling on you because because of your work so far with kind of representing the data in a way that you're showing progress. What if yesterday was about establishing the experiment, establishing whether there's signal, but today is all about getting data around like hard data that would basically provide rationale for moving something forward. Like this is the grounds where if you're going to make the case for a lean startup, a design sprint, of something that R&D can consider a business anything, this day is dedicated to making the case for why it's important to have a business or a company or something else to put their emphasis on. So now this is really the bridge into here's the data, underlying data we're seeing with these parameters that seem to indicate that there is desirability for this product or service. So that this is the jumping off point for teams or individuals to create something and bring it to someone else for approval or consideration.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those awkward things is both and. So one of the things, term we haven't used across this whole thing is initial level of interest and ongoing level of interest. So they're all on a progression. So it starts out as the weirdest, wacky idea. You have no knowledge whether anybody wants it, but your view of the world, it sucks because, and you end up with a product. So there's stuff that's very quick and easy to do to get those early signals, and that then takes you into some of the higher fidelity stuff on whether there's ongoing interest, and it depends on the business model behind it, whether it's a one-off purchase. So it's one of those awkward things is in terms of the audience you're trying to take this to, what are you trying to do with them? Are you simply doing it as a training exercise, or are you trying to use it as a process where people can use it to grow their businesses or to change the world? Or so there's a different reason for this whole thing to exist, and I've never been quite sure on where you're trying to take it as a commercial type product, or whether you just want to create something that where people can try and figure out how to change the world.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to pose, because it presupposes, is there an intent that starts from the very beginning on trying to be able to make something work in the way that somebody phrases it? Is it just because of pure discovery that somebody finds an opportunity? It can go in different directions, but my assumption with creating this was that the ends are going to justify the means in a way, so that the end result is going to point you in a direction of where it could go. You may have an intent of being able to supplement an existing product lineup so that you're going to add something new to it, so that that's going to basically color the way you kind of initially engage it, all the way to like something where you're starting up brand new, where you just have a hunch. And you just want to see where it goes, and you don't have a business framework or a particular thing, but you do have something that signals opportunity. And then it's a matter of having conversations with people to see how they interpret it and where it could go. So it could run the gamut. But I think it's the way it's framed up initially is where the process could eventually lead it.
Yeah, so I think working on this particular board, it has a lot to do with, they said, the journey you got to this day. What is it? So if you're working with a commercial organization where there are a whole lot of things at play, then the way you work with the Pretotypes is potentially very, very different than you would if you were just gathered a bunch of like-minded people who are concerned a particular area, and you brainstormed how to change the world kind of approach. And those kind of things you should be just trying to get interest. So the initial level of interest, so it should be the simple stuff like fake doors and YouTubes. Yep. The quickest, dirtiest, cheapest thing you can do to figure out whether your hunch is worth pursuing further than.
Yeah. And before we did Bayes' theorem, or before Bayes' theorem came out, before Alberto put all this stuff out, I was looking at the approach of the likelihood of success and taking it by the book. So if I bring people down here, again, this is a mural rendering of something that can be easily done in Excel or something else. But the idea is that based on the experiment of the amount of points that are gotten there, the points and possible in terms of like what your projected amount of points is based on the percentages of your audience and what actually transpires, is where you have the same kind of arrangement that the book has, only you're a bit more detailed about where things go. Hey.
Roblox isn't working on the PC.
Okay. Did you have breakfast already?
Yeah.
Okay. I can take a look at it in about 10 minutes. Will that work?
All right.
Check and see if the internet is working. And if not, see if you're connected.
I am connected and it is working.
Okay. But can you get websites up?
I tried Comac Games and it isn't working either.
Oh, so did you go to like Google and does the website come up then? By just typing in Google?
I've only checked out Roblox and Comac Games.
But you still have the Wi-Fi signal in the lower right, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But Roblox isn't working.
Yeah.
Give it a couple of minutes to refresh and it should work.
All right.
If it doesn't, come back over, okay?
All right.
Okay. The consultant, my son. So the idea is that you're using the possible points and as well as the particular points, and based on the experiments that you run, whether it's individual or as a group, you can figure out which ones have more traction versus ones that don't. And overall, out of the 5, you have a 50-50, so you have an even shot, which is like not too successful. But this would speak to which experiments seem to have like the most representative. So you basically have variations or scenarios of a theme where you have multiple teams or multiple individuals running similar experiments. There are variations of them. So this was my attempt at being able to mimic the likelihood of success that's indicated in the book, and basically projecting that out in terms of like what is possible versus what you have, and then using that percentage to figure out where you can go from there. So based on what you had done in your scenarios, if you take these variations and reframe them and do just these and take these 2 out and cast it again in a different set of experiments, you may get closer to something that works. But the idea is that you have to run at least like anywhere from 5 to 15 experiments that are very micro, but they're variations on a theme to really get to the end, and kind of hone in on where that opportunity is. And Graham, do you mind if I bring over your Bayes theorem one? If you have it handy, you can bring it right into the.
Let me just fetch it quickly.
Okay. So for reference, Graham actually did a rendering of what Alberto Savoy had put up on his YouTube site around Bayes' theorem, but did a visual representation of it in a different way. It's different from what I've done in the sense that it takes like percentages and uses algorithms, but he essentially worked it so that based on the amount of experiments you do, it shows the long-term probability for success. So it's just a different way of looking at the data. So that's why I had suggested to Graham earlier that there's an experiment phase where you kind of go through the steps of building it out and understanding how to do it. Then there's the actual data representation phase of what the results were and how to interpret those and how those would carry the conversation forward.
Right, let me just find it down the bottom here. So I've got your. Okay.
Well, Graham's getting things together. JF, what do you think of this? Is this something where your eyes glaze over because of all the numbers and the points and everything else? Or is this something where you translate it and say, okay, this is kind of where we're success, or would you rather this be done in a different platform altogether?
I have no opinion at the moment. Primarily because I haven't gotten there yet in terms of some of Alberto Savoy's work. I like the fact that it is data-driven. I'm just trying to, I don't have an opinion because I kind of want to see the logic behind it.
Okay.
And that's where I'm having a disconnect at the moment.
You want to see it play out, basically.
Yeah.
You want me to walk you through the way it worked?
Yeah, go for it. You can actually like produce like what you do with Bayes matrix.
Yeah. So the way he so his initial thing is that, the law of market failure is that 90% of things will fail. So the initial probability of success is defined to be 10%. So that's this one on the left-hand side. The initial level of confidence is predefined to be 10%. And then on the right-hand side here, the little square blocks, there's in looking at results from experiments, they're either much better than expected, somewhat better than expected, inconclusive because it was just a bum test, or it's very close to the middle. And mainly if it's a bum test, worse than expected, much worse. And then he has his metrics are for that are essentially is much better has to be over twice as many. Somewhat better is between the X that you set. So if you set it 20%, then somewhat better is between 20 and 39%. And then on the worst side, below your expectation is you go down to half. So he essentially does ratios of 2 from your 20%. So we do the first experiment, and that one comes back with your first experiment. Let's look it up again. Your first experiment was 22 out of 10. Okay, so your 22 out of 10 is more than twice as much. So starting on the red bottom and getting the blue square on the bottom right means that you can now shift the probability of success from 10% to 50%. Does that make sense, Robert? I mean, you can confirm that you understand it. Does it make sense? Got it. Okay, so what we do then is we would, if I've just shown it sequentially with all of the results here, you'd move it from the initial up to 50%. So after experiment 1, we've got that. Experiment 2 was 42 out of 30. So that was less than 2 times, so that comes back green. So when you're already at a 50% probability and you come back with a green answer, it means you can shift it to 70%. So the axis between where you are and the green says you then, after experiment 2, you push the likelihood up to 70%. Then experiment 3, you had a result of 75 out of 80, which is slightly worse than expected. So it's in the equivalent of the 10 to 19% result equivalent. So sitting at 70 and getting an orange result means you have to drop back to 50% probability. So then it drops back to after experiment 3 to 50% probability. And so you go. Then experiment 4, is 402 out of 200. So that's more than 2 times. So you're back at 50. Blue, you can take it up to 90 now. So then after experiment 4, it's up to 90. Now experiment 5, you collapse back to even odds, which is essentially where Robert ended up as sort of 721 over 720 points. You end up at the same place, but this is using Alberta's Bayes mathematics table to get there.
So Finn, I want you to go ahead and repeat exactly what Graham said.
No problem. I think I actually understood.
Okay, I'm only kidding with you. I figured you would.
No, I think it makes quite a lot of sense.
It's just understanding how you would actually navigate the table and what you would do when you were starting at a particular point on the left and being able to kind of work that through. So Graham, if I'm understanding correctly, this matrix is basically a predictability model based on where you're going with things.
Yeah, so you initially assume, because the overall statistics is 90%, so therefore you start at very unlikely at 10%, and your experimentation will take you up the ladder or not. And what he was arguing is that he wouldn't invest in anything that didn't get north of 70%.
Right. And probably you would need a string of experiments to show how you would evolve into that 90%. So you start from 10% and see how you've actually gone about learning it.
Yep.
So the method or the way of constructing that and showing it could be preferential to any particular individual, but this is one way of kind of starting from that point and using that matrix to do it.
Yeah, so I think in the earlier stages where you're doing the very simple Pretotypes like the fake door or the YouTube video, is to create 4 or 5 different places you go and look at that audience, and that will then give you the initial level of signal. And as your Pretotypes get more sophisticated, you would then essentially, instead of doing 5 versions of an MVP, you would do an MVP, you would do some of those other ones which are more high fidelity, more expensive, but would continue to give you the data on whether you've got the right it. So the initial level of interest is very much about creating a set of at least 5 probably that gives you whether you're going to, whether you are in the 70% range plus, and then you evolve from there. And each step you take.
You basically set up 5 different fishing spots, and then based on those over time, you figure out which particular spots seem to have the most fish, or that you can continue to basically get something from those.
Yeah, so the initial one where all you've got is a concept, where you would use essentially the same fishing spot but different bait. Maybe not the right analogy, but you'd use fake door with different audiences, different places where you go and find the audience.
Got it.
And they should all confirm that the overall audience, the big X that you created, the big X, that's the percentage. The audience, the big audience, in other words, all entrepreneurs under 30. And you'd be trying to find a percentage of a smaller audience, but you do 4 or 5 of those with a fake door, or 4 or 5 of those with a video. And then from there, you move on to the more advanced Pretotypes and do sequential ones and iterate the variations on the product.
Got it. And did Alberto have an Excel spreadsheet that he put out where you can put the data in and it would do this, or is this your version where? Okay.
No. This is I just this was he had on his whiteboard in the background. I just copied it, but he's got a spreadsheet. If you go to his website, you can download.
And it does the same.
Does the same thing, yeah.
No, it doesn't does the same. It's better than this, because this is complex. It takes time to understand. It takes time to compute an outcome. The Google Sheet he did is great. You just input your data and you get your outcome, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, this is a visual to kind of explain it, though. I get what Graham's doing, but yeah, the spreadsheet is good for actual input of data. So we have 4 minutes left. Rather than me kind of doing more conversation, there was a lot presented here. What I'd like to do really fast is kind of go through the people that are on the panelist side and just get their impressions of this so far. So I'm going to just start with one who's kind of in my window. So I'm going to start with you, Finn. What's your overall impression of what was presented today?
I think it's really interesting. I haven't really worked with Pretotyping before, so for me it was great to see and learn about. I think one topic that we touched on in the session today was the question of showing the examples for the different types of prototyping tests. And I think one solution that wasn't explored yet was just to put the blue and green cards, the start and ending points, below each other, and explain the prototyping tests by just showing the green and blue cards, not explaining the entire thing, but only outlining the beginning and the end. And Cody went on about making this a natural group process by making multiple rows of cards, and then letting the group basically naturally decide. And you could expand by making even more, by just displaying the prototyping tests as beginning and ends. It could be sort of more open-ended, where participants could add more green and blue cards as a different type of prototype tests.
So you're saying that so every single prototype here would have a beginning, start, and end hypothetical for each of these that would help to anchor things?
I would leave out the explanation you had, like the explanation cards. I would delete all of this, and then I would just have like the beginning and the end cards in rows. And then you could have a couple of spare green and blue cards for people to come up with their own specific ideas for prototyping tests. You muted.
Thank you. It's very nice of you to suggest that. I like that idea a lot. Alberto, what are your thoughts overall today? What you experienced here?
I think you are doing great improvements here. I think this is great, and I just will say this, that in all we did today, excluding the formulation of the WXYZ hypothesis, everything, in my perspective, should be more directive and less based in ideation and open for discussion. I think a couple of things here are still a lot dependent of what the team decides, and presumes a lot of discussion and eventually consensus votation. I don't know, but I think we should be more straight to the point in these steps, and that's it. I think you should have the 5 prototypes available for reference and a starting point to define steps to implement it. And I think that times and budgets should be given a score, not a specific time, because that will depend of the company. I think that the success meter should be just a small area where you go to the Google Sheet, computer number, and then write it in the board for reference. Just that.
Yeah, so the board itself isn't used for calculations. The board's basically like a way of basically projecting out what the spreadsheet has. So, see you later, JF. Thanks for coming by. I know you got to go. Take care. All right. Thanks for your time. Let's see. Who else needs to jettison right now? Like, you basically have 11:30. You need to go. Raise your hand if you do. We're only going to take like 2 or 3 minutes to go through everybody else's impressions. So, for the rest of you lot, let's see. Let's go to Graham next. Graham, what do you think so far?
I think you've done an amazing job here. And this is where the rubber hits the road, is because the whole thing is about trying to do the prototyping. So this is a really important page to kind of make flexible and easily usable. But I think you've got all the ingredients there. I'm a mathematician background, so that's why I like the kind of mathsy bits. I'm one of Alberto's geeky guys that says they understood what he was talking about.
Yeah, I was in pre-calc when I was in ninth grade, so I'm right there with you. I'm math oriented, but I get the notion that people need to kind of have like a very basic understanding or a very basic explanation. I just think of my own mother with trying to understand or have her understand computers, and I kind of go from that background. It's like I gotta keep it really simple, otherwise I'm going to lose people. But yeah, thank you for that. We'll just see how it evolves and eventually comes down to like getting towards the final version of things. Cody, what have you been thinking so far for today in terms of what you've been seeing here?
I really like the switch to like once we kind of went from the where we ended up yesterday into the YX WXYZ, and then kind of that I can really see the flow, like the progression kind of down this board, from kind of a more expanded version of creating the steps and choosing the Pretotype option or creating a new one, and then kind of continuing to refine it. So I think it has lots of like it has lots of steps, but they're broken down in pieces that each step kind of refines and polishes it further. And I can imagine kind of when you're done, it's like, yes, let's go and test it, and we know what to do with the results. There's that clarity to know how to bring it back. So yeah, I think you've done a fabulous job. I mean, it's complex, but the process it needs the nuances. Like it really, I don't think you've missed anything. And if a team were to go through this process, I think they'd have all the steps to refine it, and then all the ways to kind of bring it back and interpret the results in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think what I need to do is definitely consider kind of using elements from yesterday and today and kind of bringing them together and then having them translate into numbers later on through some of the techniques that we're seeing here. But yeah, I think it's close, but it just needs another wash, I think. And last but not least, Diana, what have you been thinking? What are some suggestions you may have for this?
So first of all, today really, I felt like it all makes sense today. You have a starting point and you have an ending point, and all the dots in between connect. What I felt, I don't know, but that's just where my brain went. When I saw, once I understood the metrics down below, and I'm thinking about the statistical approach, I was thinking that maybe a field where you could reflect on the different parameters of your test to document them would be beneficial, and in my opinion quite necessary, because if you make iterations, you should have a way to look back at what you changed, to have an idea of why your outcomes might be different. I think that's something that might have a little space in here, such that you know how you can reproduce your results.
So a change log of some type, but also almost a diary of different things.
And also an overview of which different characteristics of your test you could potentially change. Maybe you could first do like a small brainstorm once you decided on a test. So what could be factors that affect the outcome of this test? And then it can be the time, it can be the place where you post your advertisement, for example, or a different set of factors. But as soon as you think about what could impact this test, you can focus on a certain set and then start switching them up. And maybe you have this backlog of potential factors, and you can start grabbing and switching and doing the puzzle until the numbers work.
If not Miro, Diana, what would you reach for to kind of do that change log, or to kind of document those changes?
Whiteboard.
Okay, got it. There you go. So not digital.
I mean, you could also do an Excel sheet, I guess, but that's, as soon as you even use this word, there are many people who flinch,
Change log, yeah.
Change log and Excel sheet. So
I hear a collective groan across the world from devs when they hear change log sometimes. Yeah.
So I do like to keep it visual and airy with Post-its. because everybody has it in, just before their eyes. But I think that's something that would be important here if you want to work with a matrix like this.
Okay.
Otherwise, you start changing and you don't remember what you did. And you don't know what could be the reason for the change.
True. I almost wonder if you could just make Loom videos and just basically use that as a way of kind of describing what the changes were from state to state, so that you can make it very audio video centric, and people can walk you through what changes so that you don't have to read per se, but you can literally just use video and then copy and paste the Loom URL into a mural. And then from one scenario to the next, you just basically explain what the details are. And they can be like 2 minutes long, but they really go into the details without having to read or document anything. So just a thought. Anyway, we are over time again, as always, by 7 to 8 minutes. This is day 4. I want to thank everyone for kind of coming by and checking this out and helping me work through this process. Because obviously, if I didn't have all of you, I would be presenting something that was pure garbage. No, I'm kidding. It really wouldn't be as optimal as it could be. So my thanks to all of you who took the time to come out and really get into things. Oh, you don't need any help anymore? Fantastic. Okay, so when we did a shot yesterday, or at least a group shot, was the theme that everyone got to their camera really close, or was that yesterday's? Oh, Graham, I can't hear you.
I think that was one of the mastery groups.
Okay, so we could do it then this year. So basically the theme for today is you move really close to your camera and you give some sort of face, and they could do it that way. And I'll take a picture. All right, are you ready? Like Fed's got to get, there you go. Like you're looking for somebody on the other side. Where are they? 1, 2, 3. All right, fantastic. Thanks to everybody who showed up on Zoom to check this out. Thanks to everybody on YouTube that's watching in the future and right now. We're going to be back for day 5. It's going to be a retrospective. Hopefully, I'm going to have the entire thing kind of basically modified, changed, graphed out so you can see the progression from each day to kind of see the work that we did for the entire week. So fingers crossed, I'm going to put some time to that and get it done before we have our session tomorrow at 10 CT, okay? So y'all have a good day, night, wherever you are. Get some rest, take care, ride your bike, wear masks, stay safe, and talk to you.